A steel blade does not care about the name of the man holding it. It only cares about the density of the bone it is meant to cut. You stand frozen in a chamber that holds no sound. Across your arm, a young man named Dong Xian breathes slow in sleep. You are Emperor Ai. The largest empire on earth answers to your voice. Your generals wait beyond these walls. Your ministers pace outside the door. And yet you refuse to wake him. You lift the knife. You slice through the silk of your own robe. You walk out with half a sleeve missing. For 2,000 years, scholars wrote this down as the most tender gesture in Chinese history. They called it romance. They called it love. Every word of it was a lie. Because what happened behind those red palace walls was never a romance. It was an industry. For 20 centuries, the imperial courts of China ran a silent operation that processed young men like prized animals. It was a machine built on a single cold calculation. Your face purchased your throne, and your age purchased your grave. What you are about to hear is the version nobody was allowed to write down. The real economics of the most expensive human beings in imperial history. The dirt roads cutting through the Han Empire in 15 BC carried no poetry. They carried the sound of hunger. When winter dropped its weight across the northern provinces, the mud hardened into ridges sharp enough to split a leather sandal. And right behind the first hard freeze came the men nobody wanted to see. The tax collectors. For a farmer working a stretch of land barely wide enough to bury a horse, the arithmetic of the empire was brutal, and it was simple. The state demanded its share in grain, in silk, or in copper coins. A dry summer meant empty granaries. A cold snap meant dead silkworms curled inside rotting cocoons. The debt did not care about the weather. The debt remained, and the punishment for falling behind was not a fine. It was slavery for the entire family line. Every son, every grandson, every daughter, marked as property of the empire forever. A father staring at that future had one last asset on his land. He had boys. The wagons came in the gray hour before sunrise. They carried no flags. There were no imperial seals painted on the canvas. No drums announced their arrival. These wagons belonged to the court purveyors, men whose job was to travel the back roads of the empire with heavy wooden chests bound in black iron. Locals whispered the true name for them in the frozen fields. Flesh merchants. Nobody said it out loud. A scout did not examine a child the way a village elder might. He did not ask about the boy's character. He did not care about his intelligence. He examined the child the way a gem cutter examines a rough stone held up to the morning light, hunting for the hidden fractures that might ruin the final polish. The father shoved his 7-year-old son into the cold. The boy's bare feet stuck to the frost on the mud. The scout lowered himself to one knee. He did not ask the child's name. Names did not matter where this boy was going. The scout's calloused thumbs moved along the child's jawline, pressing hard into the bone to test the density underneath. He checked the cheekbones for perfect symmetry. He pulled the small mouth open and studied the gums for the pale tint of scurvy, then counted the teeth one by one. A crooked bite meant the deal was over before it began. His fingers slid down the boy's throat and pressed against the voice box, feeling for the vocal cords, calculating exactly how that voice might fracture when puberty arrived 5 winters from now. He measured the width of the shoulders. He gripped the thigh to gauge the length of the bone. The court had a specification sheet. The product needed to be slim, balanced, and biologically capable of holding that shape for 20 years. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes. The scout gave a single nod. A scribe stepped forward and dropped 50 copper coins into the father's palm. The father never looked at his son again. He looked at the coins. The boy climbed into the back of the wagon where 20 other children were already sitting in total silence. The wheels began to turn. In that moment, the boy stopped existing. What stepped out of that village was no longer a son. It was inventory. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The wagons rolled for weeks toward Chang'an, the glittering capital of the empire. Inside, the darkness under the canvas was absolute. The boys sat pressed shoulder to shoulder, their knees pulled tight against their chests to make room for the fresh cargo picked up from the next village. They received water in measured clay cups, exactly enough to keep the kidneys from failing. They received millet gruel in tiny wooden bowls, exactly enough to prevent their major organs from shutting down. The scouts had learned a long time ago that weakness was their best luck. A starving boy does not plan an escape. A starving boy does not fight the gods. A starving boy does not even remember the road behind him. By the time the massive walls of Chang'an rose against the horizon like a second mountain range, most of the boys could no longer picture the layout of their own homes. The memory of their mothers' faces had been erased by the constant, dull ache of hunger. They did not enter through the grand gates of the Imperial palace. Raw material did not deserve ceremony. The wagons turned down a narrow, mud-slicked service road and delivered them to a complex of low brick buildings tucked behind the bureaucratic quarter. No windows looked out onto the city. No courtyards opened to the open sky. There were only thick stone walls, iron doors, and heavy locks that only opened from the outside. This was the factory floor. This was where a human being was unmade. The transformation started inside the first hour. Guards stripped the boys of the coarse wool and rough hemp they had worn from their villages. They threw every garment into stone fire pits already burning in the center of the yard. The black smoke carried the last physical trace of their homes into the gray sky. Barbers moved down the line with iron shears, shaving every scalp completely raw. The reasoning was cold and practical. Shaved heads killed the lice that traveled with every shipment from the provinces. Shaved heads also killed identity. A bald boy wearing nothing looks exactly like the bald boy beside him. The eye cannot tell them apart. Neither can memory. The instructors walked the line with bamboo ledger boards resting against their forearms. They assigned numbers. They did not assign names. The idea of a family lineage no longer applied inside these walls. The boy born as the youngest son of a wheat farmer in the north ceased to exist on paper. He became a figure in a column. He became the absolute property of the inner court, filed neatly between the boy in front of him and the boy behind him. The curriculum of the compound had only one real subject: the total erasure of human reflex. These boys had to learn the geometry of palace space down to the millimeter. Their eyes could never rise above the waist sash of an instructor. Their lips could not move unless a direct question had been asked. They could not cough. They could not sneeze. They could not let a shiver cross their shoulders even in rooms where the winter air turned their breath white. To engrave these rules into the living tissue of the body, the instructors used violence that was measured, surgical, and chillingly intentional. They never hit the face. A discolored cheek or a split lip lowered the market price of the asset. They never hit the hands. Fingers needed to float across the silk strings of the guqin without hesitation or stiffness. Instead, when a boy broke a rule, they made him kneel on a patch of crushed pottery shards spread across the stone floor. Any shift in weight, any attempt to ease the agony, drove the sharp ceramic edges deeper into the flesh of the knees. For lesser offenses, like mispronouncing a single syllable in a classical poem, the punishment moved to the soles of the feet. 2 men pinned the boy on his stomach. A third stepped forward with a heavy rattan cane. 10 strikes left the arches purple and inflated. 20 strikes opened the skin in long, deep splits. The boy was still required to stand upright for music practice at sunrise the next day. He was expected to smile. Beauty alone was never the end goal of the machine. A favorite had to function as an intellectual mirror for the emperor, a reflection cast back in perfectly educated form. The boys sat for 14-hour stretches inside rooms where the charcoal braziers were deliberately kept cold. They memorized the Book of Songs in full. They recited the Analects of Confucius until the classical words arrived faster than their own breath. They traced the exact, razor-thin brush strokes of court calligraphy across fresh parchment. If a boy's fingers grew stiff from the cold, if the brush slipped from his grip, the instructor did not yell. He reached for a heated iron rod kept in the coals and pressed it against the inside of the boy's forearm. The burns healed in dark, permanent rings of scar tissue. The long silk sleeves of the palace would hide them from every visitor for the rest of the boy's life. Food was not nourishment in this compound. It was a chemistry experiment. Court doctors designed specific feeding programs engineered to delay puberty and lock the human body into a slender frame that refused to grow into a man's shape. They stripped out protein almost entirely. The daily ration arrived as a pale, tasteless paste made from crushed lotus root, boiled cabbage, and rice wine diluted until it barely carried color. The diet kept the skin translucent and the limbs thin as reeds. It also kept the boys trembling at the edge of starvation every hour of every day. And that hunger was the quiet hand on the leash. A boy who spends his nights dreaming of a single spoon of rice is not a boy who is dreaming of freedom. The cosmetic regimen crossed the line into slow, deliberate poisoning. The court demanded skin that looked like polished porcelain under the flicker of oil lamps. To achieve this, the boys were required to coat their faces every morning with thick layers of wet powder ground from white lead and rice flour. The lead soaked through the pores. The lead entered the blood. After years of daily application, the heavy metal settled deep into the nervous system and began dismantling it from the inside out. The boys suffered from crushing headaches that lasted for days. Their hands began to tremble without warning during music lessons. Some went completely blind in sudden, terrifying episodes that lasted hours and then passed. The court administrators did not care. An emperor wanted a flawless face beside him at dinner. A poisoned boy with a flawless face was worth more in the palace ledger than a healthy boy whose skin had ever been touched by the sun. The human voice received its own separate laboratory. To guarantee soft, silver tones that would never crack with age, the boys trained their breathing for hours. They submerged their faces in basins of icy water and held their breath until their lungs caught fire, learning to command the smallest involuntary motions of the diaphragm. They sang long, flat notes into empty clay jars for half the night, studying the echo. A single crack in the voice at the wrong moment could end a career overnight. And in the inner court, the end of a career was rarely a peaceful retirement. The factory accepted loss as part of the initial design. Administrators openly projected a 40% defect rate. The human body naturally refuses perfection, and the body won more battles than the court wanted to admit. Dysentery spread through the holding rooms when the water cisterns turned stagnant in the August heat. Infections crept up from the split skin on their feet and settled into the bloodstream, causing fatal fevers. Some boys simply starved at the desk during calligraphy practice, slumping forward onto the wet ink and never waking up. Suicide claimed everyone else. The total isolation, the surgical violence, the enforced silence, all of it drove the boys into a quiet, dark place where no instructor could reach them. A boy would wait until the guards changed shifts at the third watch of the night. He would uncoil the hemp cord from the sash at his waist, loop it over a dark wooden rafter, and close out his own production cycle before sunrise. The instructors showed no grief. They cut the rope. They dragged the body through the back door by the hair. They threw it into a lime pit dug behind the compound where the chemical earth dissolved bone within weeks. Then they wiped the number from the bamboo ledger with a wet cloth. Defective product. The state wrote off the copper cost and moved on to the next shipment. The boys who survived the full 5U gauntlet eventually reached their graduation. Their skin was pale as carved bone. Their calligraphy moved across the page like running water. Their voices had been tuned to sound like soft bronze bells striking in the wind. They could recite 1,000 classical poems without missing a single syllable. They could cross a marble floor without producing a single sound from their slippers. And somewhere along that brutal road, every single one of them had forgotten what their mothers looked like. The court tailors entered the windowless brick compound. They wrapped each survivor in layer after layer of embroidered silk, fabrics so heavy and stiff the boys had to completely relearn how to balance their weight when they walked. They clipped carved jade ornaments to their belts. They painted their mouths with red cinnabar pulled from sealed porcelain jars. The factory had completed its run. The product was ready to enter the market. The boys stepped out of those windowless brick halls and walked for the first time into the gold-soaked maze of the inner palace. They believed they had already lived through the worst the Empire could show them. They were wrong. The factory had only been the preparation. The real danger had not even opened its eyes yet. It was sitting inside the golden cage, waiting for them to walk in. The heavy wooden doors of the inner palace swung shut with a sound closer to a trunk splitting open in a forest than a door closing. The iron bolts slid home with a long, deliberate grind. The boys stood frozen in the center of a massive courtyard paved with white marble so polished it reflected the moving clouds. The air carried three distinct scents braided together: crushed orchids, burning sandalwood, and underneath them both, the faint, sweet rot of still water trapped in ornamental pools. Eunuchs wrapped in patterned silk surrounded the new arrivals. They held tall lanterns that threw long, jagged shadows across the stone like dark fingers reaching for the boys' feet. These graduates of the brick factory believed they had finally reached shelter. They were catastrophically wrong. What they had done was trade a windowless slaughterhouse for a cage made of solid gold. The architecture of the Imperial harem was not designed for living. It was designed as a weapon. It was a slow-motion instrument of psychological disorientation. The corridors bent and curved and then bent again in identical loops until memory itself gave up trying to map the space. Red lacquered pillars stood every few paces, all cut to the exactly same height, all carved with the same repeating patterns. Every window was filtered through wooden screens so thick the sunlight arrived diced into meaningless squares on the floor. A boy could spend 20 years inside the inner court and never once see a real horizon. The state assigned each new arrival a single windowless chamber buried deep within the maze. Inside that room sat a heated brick bed, a small bronze mirror, and a single silk pillow stuffed with dried herbs. There were no locks on the inside of any door. The eunuchs held the keys to the rooms. The eunuchs held the keys to the kitchens. The eunuchs held the keys to the air itself, because in this place, survival was granted and revoked by the men with the iron key rings hanging from their sashes. Staying alive inside the harem had nothing to do with physical strength. Muscle was completely useless here. Survival was a war fought entirely inside the mind. The court housed hundreds of boys at any given time, sometimes more than 1,000. But the emperor had only one evening, only one bed, only one pair of eyes. Attention was the only currency that existed in this closed economy. The absence of attention was a slow, psychological starvation. And the boys figured out within their first week that the greatest threat to their future was not the emperor looming at the top of the pyramid. The real threat was the boy sleeping in the room next door. The boy with the exact same training. The boy with the same lethal calculations running behind his painted face. The sabotage inside the golden cage was quiet. It was constant. And it was highly creative. A rising favorite would wake up before a critical command performance and discover the silk strings of his guqin had been sliced through with a razor blade in the hours before dawn. A boy celebrated for his porcelain cheeks might pick up his lacquer jar of face powder one morning and find it had been seeded overnight with crushed glass ground fine as flour. He would apply it. Within seconds, the lead and glass would open thin red lines across his face. His career ended before sunrise. The eunuchs would drag him down the corridor by his ankles, his silk robes wiping the blood from the marble. The boys who remained did not look up. They did not flinch. They stepped over the red trail on their way to morning practice, and they smiled at each other over their tea. Food was not nourishment in this world. Food was the primary delivery system for murder. The Imperial kitchens produced banquet-grade meals daily, roasted pheasant glazed with honey, lotus seed broth simmered for hours, steamed carp arranged on porcelain plates with radishes shaped like flowers. A boy who had fallen out of favor received cold congealed rice and a bowl of lukewarm water. A boy climbing the ladder received delicacies. He also received poison, slipped in at the end of the ladle by a kitchen hand who had been paid a month's wages in hidden gold. The preferred weapon was an extract pulled from the oleander plant. Oleander does not kill immediately. That is the entire point of its design. It makes the heart race and skip in unpredictable bursts. It floods the lungs with the sensation of drowning on dry land. The victim collapses mid-performance, soaked in sweat, shaking, unable to hold a single musical note. The emperor looks up from his wine and sees a broken, sickly creature twitching on the floor. The emperor looks away, and the boy who ordered the poison steps quietly into the empty space at the ruler's side. The pressure of maintaining the illusion of flawless divinity around the clock began to shatter their minds. They performed without pause. There was no offstage. If the emperor wanted a song at 3 in the morning, the boy had to rise from sleep and produce a voice like polished silver, showing no trace of exhaustion. They smiled until the muscles in their faces cramped into hard knots under the lead paint. To endure the unbearable weight of non-stop performance, they turned to chemistry. The court physicians supplied them with a compound known throughout the dynasty as 5-mineral powder. The recipe was no secret: crushed stalactites scraped from cave ceilings, yellow sulfur, powdered quartz, and amethyst ground to dust. The boys dissolved the mixture in warm rice wine and drank it alone in their rooms. The chemical reaction inside the body was savage. The heavy metals and sulfur ignited a slow, violent heat that spread from the core outward. Their skin flushed bright crimson in patches. They tore off their silk robes and walked barefoot across the frozen courtyard stones in the dead of winter just to keep their blood from cooking inside their veins. The powder also dragged the mind into territory the body could not follow. It induced hallucinations so vivid the boys described shapes moving inside the walls. It numbed the nervous system until fear became a distant sound. A boy floating on 5-mineral powder felt nothing. That was the entire point. The price of that numbness was physical collapse on a cellular level. The powder stripped the enamel from their teeth until the surfaces turned soft and yellow. It opened deep, weeping sores across their backs and thighs. They packed the sores with cotton and hid them beneath extra layers of heavy silk. They coated their rotting teeth with white mineral paint. They became walking corpses held together by chemistry and fear, smiling at banquets while their bodies disintegrated underneath the embroidered silk. But the real executioner in the harem was not poison, or jealousy, or the powder. It was time. The court worshipped youth the way other cultures worshipped gods. At 18, a boy was treated as an earthly deity. At 24, something shifted. A microscopic line appeared at the corner of one eye. The jawline widened by a fraction of an inch. Nobody could measure, but everybody could see. The invitations to the private chambers grew sparse. Then they stopped entirely. The fall was brutal and fast. The eunuchs moved the aging boys out of the inner rings of the palace and into the outer buildings where the wind came through the walls. The food grew thin. They had entered what the palace called the ghost phase. They drifted through the damp stone corridors in frayed robes, coughing into their sleeves, haunting the edges of a court that had already forgotten their names. Most did not wait for the cold to finish them. They found a high wooden rafter in an unused hall. They used the embroidered sashes that had once marked their rank. The cycle turned. New boys arrived in wagons at dawn. Sometimes, though, the system broke. Sometimes an emperor's obsession with a single favorite burst through the careful architecture of the court and infected the state itself. That is where we come back to Emperor Ai in the year 4 BC. Dong Xian was nobody when the story started. He was a minor attendant, standing quietly near a doorway holding a basin of warm water for someone else. The emperor happened to walk past. The emperor stopped. The emperor looked at the boy's face. The empire cracked down the middle in that single second. Emperor Ai did not simply take Dong Xian into his bed. He took him into the throne room. He tipped the contents of the national treasury into the boy's lap and then kept pouring. He commissioned a second palace for Dong Xian designed as a mirror image of the imperial residence. He ordered the state architects to carve out a tomb for Dong Xian directly beside his own mausoleum, so they could be buried side by side like married rulers. Then the emperor turned to the military. He summoned the Grand Council, men who had spent 4 decades riding the frozen northern steppes, men missing fingers, men with faces cut apart by enemy arrows. He made these veterans kneel on the cold marble floor. Emperor Ai lifted the heavy bronze seal of the supreme commander of the armed forces. He walked past every decorated general in the empire. He placed that absolute authority into the hands of a 22-year-old boy wearing cinnabar on his lips and lead powder on his cheeks. Dong Xian could not lift a proper sword. He had never seen a battlefield. And now he commanded every soldier, every horse, and every walled garrison in the Han dynasty. The generals bowed their heads all the way to the stone. They bit the insides of their own cheeks until their mouths filled with blood. They surrendered to the boy out loud. And in total silence, every one of them mimized his face. They began to count the emperor's breaths. The fundamental flaw built into every favorite's existence was hidden inside the source of his power. Every coin, every title, every breath he drew was tied by an invisible thread to a single biological event, the beating of one specific heart. The emperor's. Dong Xian lay in the dense darkness of his private estate. He was 22 years old. And then a messenger arrived at his gate in the middle of the night. Emperor Ai had collapsed inside his private chambers. His chest was rattling with fluid. The emperor's heart was giving out. The cold truth arrived all at once like a stone dropped through a frozen lake. Dong Xian did not rule the empire. He never had. He was a parasite attached to a dying host. Emperor Ai released his last breath on a humid summer night in the year 1 BC. He was 25 years old. The imperial physicians took one look at the body and stepped back without speaking. They dropped straight to their knees. The single heartbeat that had powered the machinery of the entire empire had just gone silent. The information traveled inward, threading its way through the corridors to the sealed chambers of the Empress Dowager Wang Xingjun. She was a political survivor who had outlasted 3 emperors by building a heart out of polished ice. She moved for the imperial seals the moment the news arrived. Before the first light cracked the sky, she had already summoned her nephew, Wang Mang, a man who understood exactly how naked power operated when the ceremony was stripped away. He gathered a column of fully armed guards and walked straight into the inner courtyard of Dong Xian's estate. Dong Xian was standing in the great hall of his mirror palace when they kicked in the doors. He was still wrapped in the heavy layered robes of the supreme commander. He was still holding the heavy bronze seal in his soft hands. When Wang Mang stepped across the threshold and demanded the seal, Dong Xian did not call for his generals. He did not order the personal guard to draw weapons. He simply extended the bronze square and placed it into the older man's palm. And then he began to cry. It was the terminal collapse of a boy raised inside a golden cage. He had been trained in the precise angle of pouring warm wine. He had never once been trained in how to fight for his own life. The guards walked him back to his quarters and bolted the gates from the outside. He sat down beside his wife. They both understood how the court handled its leftovers. There was no such thing as exile. The machine never left loose threads. Before the sun dropped again, they swallowed a vial of concentrated poison together. The suicide should have ended the revenge. It didn't. Wang Mang wanted to erase Dong Xian from existence. When the boy's father tried to bury his son in a jade burial suit, a sacred privilege carved out only for royal blood, Wang Mang gave the order personally. Soldiers marched to the newly sealed crypt. They shattered the heavy stone doors with iron hammers. They dragged the rotting corpse out into the afternoon light. They pried the jade tiles off the flesh plate by plate until the body lay naked on the stone. Then they hauled what was left into a shallow unmarked pit that the state used for executed criminals, and they threw it in. The state auditors arrived next. They confiscated 4 billion copper coins. They seized the silk reserves, the imported horses, the storehouses of jade. They loaded the entire bloodline into prison carts and sent them south into the malarial swamps where fever took a man inside 3 years. Dong Xian had gone from ruling the planet to rotting in a nameless ditch in under 48 hours. This kind of total annihilation was the standard protocol. The Imperial machine ate its favorites on a rotation, and the process almost never varied. Dynasties cracked. Capitals burned down and rose again from the ashes under new names. The Mongols came roaring down from the northern steppes, ruled for a century, and were eventually pushed back out. The Ming dynasty erected the Forbidden City, locking the imperial cage behind towering red walls. The official language changed. The hairstyles changed. But the meat grinder inside the palace ran the same program century after century. The state kept harvesting boys. The 40% mortality rate in the training compounds held steady for 2,000 years. Generations of children had their identities stripped away, their faces painted with toxic lead, their bodies chemically dismantled by 5-mineral powder. They lived short, brilliant lives in the shadows of thrones they could never actually sit on, and they fought silent, vicious wars over a single glance from a man who regarded them as livestock. The final collapse of the system did not come wrapped in any dignity. It came crushed underneath the weight of modern history. In AD 1912, the Qing dynasty fell. The young Emperor Puyi remained locked inside the inner court, a hollow figurehead ruling over a dead structure. The last generation of palace boys drifted through the decaying halls like shadows. The state stipends stopped arriving. Within a year, the remaining attendants were quietly stealing imperial relics, jade carvings, ancient scrolls, polished gold ceremonial bowls, and smuggling them out through the service gates to sell to foreign antique dealers just to buy bowls of plain rice. In AD 1924, the warlord Feng Yuxiong surrounded the Forbidden City with modern artillery. He gave the court a few hours to vacate the grounds. The heavy wooden doors opened for the very last time in their original function. The surviving inhabitants were pushed out into the freezing streets of Beijing. They carried no identification. They possessed a set of skills that had no market value whatsoever in the industrial century they had just been thrown into. They knew how to cross a marble floor without producing a single footstep. They could recite classical poetry from memory while kneeling for hours. They could mix face powder that made the skin look like porcelain. They froze that winter in the narrow alleys behind the new factories, crouched over small fires, eating whatever scraps they could find. The final erasure arrived in AD 1949. The communist forces swept across the mainland. The new regime looked at the last surviving remnants of the Imperial court and did not see victims of a brutal 2,000-year system. They saw symptoms of a rotten feudal disease that needed to be removed. There was no rehabilitation offered. There was no apology. The state security forces began hunting down the remaining former court attendants one by one. They pulled them from rented rooms in the middle of the night. They loaded them onto trains. They sent them to forced labor camps in the frozen north, out past the Great Wall, in regions where winter temperatures killed people who had been healthy their entire lives. Men who had been trained from the age of 7 to keep their hands pale and soft were handed rusted iron pickaxes. They were ordered to break frozen earth for 14 hours a day. Their joints gave out first, then their lungs. They died anonymous deaths in anonymous pits. Then the state turned to the archives. They entered the vast Imperial record halls and they gathered the bamboo ledgers from the training compounds. They gathered the purchase receipts filed by the scouts. They gathered the medical logs from the eunuchs. They gathered the inventory lists that had counted human beings like stacks of grain. They dragged everything into the courtyards and they built enormous pyres. They set the paperwork on fire. The smoke carried 20 centuries of names into the Beijing sky and scattered them into the wind. That was the final victory of the machine. It did not simply devour their bodies in their lifetimes. It reached forward through history and devoured their memories too. We walk through the pristine museums today and stare at the jade burial suits of the emperors through thick panes of glass. We photograph the intricate silk tapestries. We admire the polished bronze swords resting on velvet mounts. We read the small plaques describing the military conquests and the economic reforms. But the thousands of boys who financed every inch of that luxury with their minds and their blood and their lives are not there. They are not in the textbooks. They are not carved into the ancestral shrines. They have no graves anyone can visit. They were purchased for strings of copper coins. They were polished into perfection, and the instant their usefulness expired, they were dropped into the dark, and the dark closed over them. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.